First things first, you're going to have to forgive my cold, but this right here is a so-called gaming PC that I managed to pick up off Facebook Marketplace for a very decent price. That decent price being about £10. So now we've established how I got this PC, why don't we get started on the quite wide range of specifications this PC comes with. To start with the specs I already knew, we have a Core 2 Quad Q6600, 4GB of DDR2 RAM, which is not an excessive amount, but enough to make the PC quite a powerhouse from back when it was released in 2008. What I didn't know is that RAM had been upgraded to 1066MHz Corsair RAM. As well as this, a Radeon graphics card had been added. I'm assuming it had one from the factory as it's got both an ATI and an AMD sticker on the front, but by the looks of things, they've taken out that ATI card and put in an AMD Radeon HD 5670, a mid-range card from its release date, but it's a DirectX 11 card and we got it in a PC for a tenner, so that's definitely got to account for something. When you've only got a tenner to spend, the fact we have any dedicated graphics card, let alone one that has modern API support, is a bit of a bonus. The real question is though, does it turn on? Pretty much as soon as I got the PC home, I plugged it into the TV, as we've actually got HDMI on this thing, to check if the PC did indeed work. And it did! For about 5 seconds, it power cycled 3 times, then promptly burnt the IEC cable to a crisp, I have no idea why, but it doesn't work anymore, and then promptly began to smell like burning. See, it hadn't sold on Marketplace for about 6 weeks, and really this could explain why it was like this. See, upon further inspection, it looks like this thing's been left in damp storage. Notice the screws on the power supply are clearly corroded, something I've only ever seen happen on cases that I leave outside before I take them to the tip. Thankfully, I did have a spare OEM power supply that's about an equivalent lying on hand, and these things go for pennies. They're often just scrap material, these power supplies, but they are still pretty decent. Fortunately, it did actually allow the PC to boot up, ensuring us that the rest of the components were actually okay. Inside though, it is in an absolutely horrific state. The OS could probably do with reinstalling, as it didn't like to boot to. It's probably 1 out of 10 times to actually boot to it properly, and there's other issues as well. It's an absolute state. There's dust, cobwebs, and there's just things that have decided to take up residence within the PC case from how long it's been sitting in storage, which can only mean one thing. We've got to take this PC outside, get it cleaned, rebuilt, and back up to a condition that might make it look, dare I say, good. With the PC all back together, I'd usually opt for Windows 7 on a PC like this. However, it is worth noting that now in 2021, a lot of titles and programs are refusing to even start to work on Windows 7 anymore. You might think, oh, this is because Windows 7's old. No, it's mostly because the DRM that's included with those programs has been updated and no longer supports Windows 7, which is incredibly frustrating and useless for DRM. So I instead have opted for the latest build of Windows 10. But before we get the pitchforks out and then people start shouting about using either Windows XP, some people are going to shout Vista, probably one guy in the comments is just spamming use Vista, and then there's about a few hundred people that are going to say use Linux. Don't worry about that. I've got a few Windows 7 benchmarks, I've got a few Linux benchmarks, and more importantly, I've actually debloated the installation. But anyway, before we find out about the general experience, what we're really all here for is to see how a £10 PC handles itself in the benchmarks. Starting off the benchmarks with GTA 5, which was a surprise on the system. Both the Q6600 and the RAM was stressed to no end. Even the little 10k RPM hard drive was working overtime. But it was all worth it with a solid 30 FPS there most of the time. However, when loading into new areas there could be a few drop frames, and most chases could actually cause this from time to time, but they were never actually too bad. It often hovered around 30 FPS, even online was fully playable. I reckon with a RAM upgrade, that little Radeon could stretch its legs a little bit more, and you'd probably see 45 to 60 FPS. However, even in its current state, still a good showing. Older titles such as Fable allowed us to ramp the settings right up, and saw the opposite of what happened in GTA 5 happen, with the graphics card actually holding us back. However, this could be a tad misleading, as Fable really only does like 2 high clocked cores, as similar with most games of this era. Still, when aiming for a 60 FPS frame rate, things were definitely doable. Towns and villages saw us dip to about the mid-50s, however everything was still fully playable, albeit not as good as my Core 2 Duo PC that I've got stashed away. Mount & Blade Warband isn't exactly renowned for its graphics, but it is renowned for its gameplay and large scope, of which the system powered through at a full 60 FPS, rarely dropping much away from this figure. Once again, another older title that would have preferred higher clocks over those extra cores, but it still allowed us to have plenty going on in the background, and we'd still hit the exact same 60 FPS frame rates. The real question though, can it run Crysis? Well, yes actually, and with rather impressive results. 720p HD once again, and the medium preset selected really did push our little Radeon more than anything else in the system. However, the game looked great and ran pretty well too. In heavy action, the Core 2 Quad could often feel a little bit unstable with its utilization, which is a common Crysis issue, but for 99.9% of the time, it was actually a pretty good system for Crysis. Now, CSGO I ran with competitive settings as people like to see. Low settings, high shadows, and a 4x3 1024x768 resolution, of which we averaged just over 100 FPS, but there was a degree of instability, which was clearly visible in both gameplay and in the benchmark. However, I expected things to fare far worse, especially given how this game prefers, once again, higher clock speeds. That's not to say this is a very competitive system, but it was an admirable showing and did run pretty well. And to bring us to the end of our benchmarks, I fired up Skyrim with the medium preset. I did turn off anti-aliasing as it was a little bit much for our little Radeon, however with that 1GB of GB DDR2 based VRAM, we powered through the game with some very respectable frame rates. The upgrades this system received mean a lot of these final era Xbox 360 titles that can utilise, well, the graphics card and the 4 cores, usually get to run these games at higher settings and twice the frame rates of the consoles it would have been competing against, leading me to believe that's probably why this machine got this specific set of upgrades. In terms of the difference between varying operating systems, as I said, there was very little to none. I did a brief bit of testing with Windows 7 and also Ubuntu to give us 3 operating systems to compare across, so that's Windows 10 Debloated, Windows 7 64-bit, and the latest release of Ubuntu. And generally across the 3 operating systems, if you ignore a few outliers, which can be down to, Linux overheads or Windows 7 being slightly more lightweight, there wasn't a great deal of difference, at least not anything you'd notice on the day-to-day. The actual day-to-day tasks itself, though, handled themselves really well on the Core 2 Quad. Unfortunately, the Radeon at the heart of this PC could actually decode most modern tasks with no issues whatsoever. For the topic of general usage itself, though, it was very, very smooth. See, with that 10,000 RPM hard drive, it was very similar to using an SSD. In fact, I was actually scared to use a hard drive until I saw how smooth it was on this, I think it's a Western Digital Velociraptor in this PC, isn't it? It was extremely smooth, modern codecs were easily chewed through by the Radeon, and those that couldn't were usually decoded pretty quick by the Q6600. Our main limit wasn't so much anything other than RAM, which means things like Discord in gaming could hurt performance, and is not ideal at all. It was fine if you had basic tasks, but running more intensive titles, there was definitely a performance deficit. Titles like GTA 5, Skyrim and onwards would definitely see a major issue due to the system running out of RAM. Still, for a tenner you can't really complain, just to stick to those older titles if you actually want to chat to your friends while you play, or multitask. Now, just before we wrap up, I really wanted to test a little bit of overclocking on this PC, because when we're not RAM limited, we were generally GPU limited on this system. So I spent a little bit of time with MSI Afterburner as well as the Unigine benchmarks to really stress out the system while we were able to boost up those clocks, which in turn, as you can see, helped performance a tad. It wasn't a great increase, but did show that, when you've got this tiny budget, any performance increase is more than welcome. Generally, it just served to make games smoother, but at the end of the day, that's what it's all about, is trying to get a smooth frame rate. So, in conclusion, I think for £10 this PC is a pretty good representation of the few bargains I've seen on Marketplace recently. With PCs becoming pretty scarce and Christmas pushing prices up, it does pain me to see that we're back to the Core 2 Quad being the main budget offering again. However, just because in its current state this PC is a bit of a performance dead end, doesn't mean that maybe £10 or £20 worth of upgrades won't push this PC a little more. We're going to need to get that Core 2 Quad overclocked, that GPU upgraded, and probably double the RAM. But with £10 to £20, I'm really looking out there, and I reckon we'll be able to build a real gaming PC out of this base for under 30 quid. However, till then, even in its current state, I really do like this little PC. Yes, it nearly caught fire, yes, it was absolutely disgusting, but it'll return very soon and in a much better state. So thank you very much for watching, and good night.